Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the second in a series of FlightGlobal webinars looking at issues around sustainable aviation. In our first one earlier this year, we discussed disruptive propulsion systems. This time, the focus is on sustainable fuel, fuel made from or partly from plants or waste rather than oil. Although sustainable fuel started being used in the industry more than a decade ago, it seems to have gathered a lot of momentum during the COVID crisis, perhaps because looser flight schedules have allowed some airlines space to experiment, and maybe because as the industry emerges from the pandemic, the need for aviation to reinvent itself as a more environmentally responsible mode of transport has come to the fore. However, there's no getting away from three huge challenges faced by the sustainable fuel sector: availability, affordability, and acceptability. Unless sustainable aviation fuel is widely available and at a price competitive with conventional fuel, it cannot take that crucial next step. And unless the traveling public accept the idea of flying at 30,000 feet in an aircraft powered by biofuel or waste fuel, all the work that the pioneers of this sector have put in so far could be wasted. So to discuss some of these themes, I'm joined by an eminent panel featuring representatives of two airlines, an industry pressure group, a leading fuel company, and an engine manufacturer. But before I introduce them, a reminder that we're live for the next hour, and there's an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists throughout the session. Use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens, and we'll try and get through as many questions as possible during the time that we have. So on to our guests. Firstly, from our sponsor, Pratt & Whitney, I'm delighted to welcome back Michael Winter, Senior Fellow for Advanced Technology and responsible for recommending to the board of Pratt & Whitney which of tomorrow's technologies it should back. Lauren Riley is Managing Director, Global Environmental Affairs and Sustainability for United Airlines and leads the carrier's environmental strategy. United has set itself a goal of zeroing out carbon emissions by 2050. Adam Morton chairs Sustainable Aviation, a coalition of UK airlines, airports, aerospace manufacturers, and air navigation service providers committed to cutting the industry's environmental impact. He's also head of environmental technology for Rolls-Royce. Ramona van der Zon is Sustainability and Reporting Manager at KLM Royal Dutch Airlines. Her academic background is in sustainable development and communication science, and that equips her, she says, to spread the word about the necessity of flying more responsibly. And finally, Andrea Moyes, Global Aviation Sustainability Director with Air BP, is fairly new to the sustainability brief after a 24-year career with Air BP and its parent company. And her remit is to help airlines source sustainable fuel and prosper on their sustainability journey. So, Michael, I'm going to start with you. What are the benefits to the environment of sustainable aviation fuel? And are engines that use the fuel just as efficient as if they were using conventional fuel? And also, as I understand it, the fuel most airlines are currently using is a 50% blend or some other percent blend of sustainable and conventional fuel. How does the industry get that figure up to closer to 100%?
Thank you, Murdo. Our industry is actively working on next generation engine technologies, and the industry is well positioned to step forward with sustainable aviation. Sustainable aviation fuels are a critical piece to meeting the industry's emissions goals. And today, they are certified as drop-in replacements compatible with all existing aircraft and the existing infrastructure. Let's put this in perspective. In 2019, the fleet burned about 100 billion gallons of fuel. Now, it's going to take a significant investment in SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel, in order to bring the capacity up, or the availability as you described it, because today it's significantly less than 1% of that 100 billion was produced. Many of the initiatives by the forward-looking airlines, some of those are represented here today, are a great start, and that's necessary, but it is not sufficient. This is a global problem, and it needs a global industrial solution. Today, there are 7 different pathways for sustainable aviation fuels that are certified. As you pointed out, up to 50% blend. There is a American Society of Testing Materials protocol 7566 that allows for these, and each of those 7 corresponds to an annex that is part of that documentation, and that is what's followed. Continued engine efficiency improvements, also including things like hybrid and hydrogen, will continue to allow us to also be critical in reducing the demand and the adoption of sustainable aviation fuels. Because when you think about it, a more efficient engine or a more efficient propulsion system will ultimately require less SAF be developed, and that will be assistant in catching up in terms of the demand curve. Now, with respect to 100% sustainable aviation fuel, today there is no standard associated with that, and that's something we need. There could also be benefits to going to 100% sustainable aviation fuel. When you start with the bio sources, typically you don't have things like sulfur in the fuel, and sulfur is implicated in the formation of contrails. Also, you generally don't have aromatic species, and the aromatics can result in formation of non-volatile particulate matter, and those, of course, are also regulated, but that also participates in the formation of both trapping gas, but also in formation of contrails. Even though we're a long way from 100% SAF availability, we need to be sure that our aircraft and our propulsion systems are going to be ready for the future, because after all, the engines and airplanes that are introduced in 2030 are going to be flying for 30 plus years. And so those engines and those aircraft systems will likely need to be able to work on any 100% SAF. And we've been working on that at Pratt & Whitney. In fact, we were running engines on 100% SAF for over a decade. We also need to ensure that the sustainable aviation fuels do not compete with food sources or agricultural sources, so that we ensure that we also don't compromise feeding the planet. This will all take considerable financial investment, and that's required both from private as well as public entities, especially to boost the infrastructure to produce these fuels, as well as a significant investment in R&D remains absolutely critical. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Lauren, if I can move to you. Zeroing carbon emissions in the next 3 decades is a huge ambition. What has United been doing so far, and what role will sustainable fuel play in achieving that goal?
Well, thank you, Murdo. And before I start, I appreciate the discussion today and being among these fine panelists. This is an important conversation we're having today. We need a lot more of it. So United committed to going 100% green last December. And what that means is that we're zeroing out the emissions from flying, but we're going to do it without relying on carbon offsets, which is a bit unique and distinct from other commitments to net zero among airlines. When we were talking about what does it mean to go net zero, what does it mean to really tackle climate change from the point of view of an airline, we quickly realized that if we were going to be genuine in our intention, if we were really going to define the North Star of decarbonization for us, we didn't want to use a mechanism that enabled status quo, that enabled the same decisions, the same behaviors, the same operations. So for us, it was a bit of a principled, philosophical point of view to say, okay, if we're going to push the boulder up the mountain, we really do need to do such. So our commitment is to do it without relying on carbon offsets. There's primarily 3 pillars of that strategy right now. The first one that is a really interesting opportunity for airlines and aviation at large is really around carbon capture and sequestration. There's a lot of opportunity there. It enables us to remove emissions both from current flight as well as years past, which is really exciting. The second pillar is really around innovation. And we just heard Michael talk about some of that with propulsion and other. There's tremendous amount of opportunity in that space. United invested recently in an electric vertical takeoff and landing company to help with urban mobility. So consider it an option other than taxi cabs, and it's about half the carbon footprint of a standard road vehicle. So that's really promising. But the one I want to talk about today is really sustainable aviation fuel. Sustainable aviation fuel has a tremendous opportunity to really decarbonize aviation. It's available today. It's drop-in ready, approximately 80% reduction on a life cycle basis of carbon emissions. So really material opportunity. I'd love to see us get to 100% SAF on our jets. Hopefully someday we will. United has been on this journey, like many on this panel today, for about a decade now, if not longer. We have worked with our partner out of Los Angeles, World Energy, to have sustainable aviation fuel on our jets out of Los Angeles every single day since 2016. So it is safe, it is reliable, it is usable, we just need more. We've also made an investment in Fulcrum Bioenergy. And this group is really interesting because they literally take the trash out of your trash can and convert it to jet fuel. And so that's really promising in terms of a pathway. If you think about feedstocks and some of the limitations of feedstocks, which I'm sure we'll talk about, waste, we've got plenty of waste in the world. So that's a really interesting opportunity for us. And today United has majority of the publicly announced commitments for sustainable aviation fuel, and we're real proud of that. But as was mentioned by Michael, you know, it's less than 1%. Far less than 1% of our annual consumption of fuel. And quite frankly, that's just not good enough. So that we have a lot of work to do as an industry.
Thanks, Laura. Now I'm going to come to Adam, which is some of that work that the industry needs to do. Can sustainable fuel on its own transform the environmental image of aviation, or is it just one tool in the kit? And how do you get this sustainable fuel message out to both airlines and industry, but also to the traveling public and the wider community?
Thank you, Murdo. In answer to your first question, the answer is no. It's not sufficient on its own. I would presage any discussion on decarbonisation of aviation with the statement that there's no one silver bullet. I think there's fairly broad agreement on this. All of the studies that have come out over the last few years, whether it's the decarbonisation roadmap that was published by my organisation, Sustainable Aviation, back in February of last year, or work by NLR as part of the Destination 2050, or the recent work that has been done by World Economic Forum and McKinsey, or the work done by Waypoint 2050, the ATAG piece of work, all conclude that sustainable aviation fuels have an important part to play in decarbonising aviation, irrespective of what the decarbonisation target is, whether it's net zero by 2050 or something less ambitious than that. But in each case, they identify SAF as usually the second or third most important lever in terms of reaching those targets. This would be alongside other major decarbonisation options. Clearly, with my Rolls-Royce hat on, I would go to engine technology first. Michael's already made reference to the fact that by making engines and aircraft more efficient, then you give the supply chain, who are working extremely hard to scale up from a relatively small proportion at the moment to something more impactful, you give them more time in order to give them more time and more scope to deliver the volumes of SAF that are necessary to meet our requirements. But at the same time, with fuel such a large proportion of the total costs associated with the carriers, by maximizing the engine efficiency and the aircraft's use of the fuel, you minimize the fuel consumption, and therefore you minimize the transition costs for the carriers themselves. And that allows you to decarbonize in a way that's more commercially or is more commercially possible and would otherwise be the case. And clearly, alongside more efficient engines and more efficient aircraft, there are other options in terms of improved air traffic management, improved aircraft operations, and certainly the work that's been done with SA suggests that not only are these impactful, but also relatively nearer term options that can help with delivering on the decarbonisation targets that we've set within the UK. In terms of the question, how do you get the message out there? I divide this into two. One would be, what message do you actually aim to get out there? Lots of people are aware of the decarbonisation benefits associated with SAF and how they can be improved. And we've started to move away from simply talking about the need to get the scale up and the costs down. And we're now starting to talk about the kinds of issues that have already been touched on in terms of life cycle CO2. Very important that we start to increase the ambitions there. And at the same time, it's already been recognised that there's a 50% blending limit on those that have been through, those that have been certified so far. And that's something which has to be talked about. But the other area where we're finding success is to identify those non-carbon benefits associated with SAF. And if those can be monetized, whether that's reduced particulate formation with improved local air quality around airports, or whether that's the impact of reduced particulates and how that feeds into reduced contrail formation, or in some cases it may be possible through high percentage blends of SAF to actually reduce maintenance, repair and overhaul inputs. You can then help to reduce the operating costs of the airlines themselves, and actually raising these non-carbon benefits as something that you get alongside the contributions towards preventing global warming is something that's incredibly important. With regards to getting the message out itself, the sorts of engine testing and the test flights that have been done recently, so Rolls-Royce has recently announced in the last few months testing our Alexis lean burn engine on 100% SAF, and some of the benefits that were associated with that. More recently, we've been working with Airbus on the eCliff 3 project, where we've been starting to explore the link between utilisation of SAF, reduced particulates, and potentially even reduced contrail formation. And doing these sorts of tests and publicising the results and showing the benefits of SAF is something that will help to garner more support for the necessary investment, both by governments, but also by the supply chain and the OEMs as well.
Excellent. Well, we're going to touch on a few of these subjects later, I hope. Ramona, KLM has been a leading proponent of sustainable aviation fuel. Why is this so important to the airline? And can you envisage a time when KLM will be operating the majority of its flights powered by sustainable fuel?
Yeah, that's a dream, right? So I think that's something that I think my whole team and maybe the whole company is dreaming of. And that's, well, I hope more than only our company, of course, because I think where we are heading to, and Lauren already started this explanation as well, United has the goal to become net zero in 2050. And that's something where we have to go to as the whole airline industry, right? So, and we have to do that actually without these carbon offsets, and we have to do it ourselves as an industry. Maybe there are not even offsets optional anymore at that time. I hope that's the case. Because then we're heading towards a fully sustainable industry. So I think what's good to mention is, of course, first before I can sum up the things that we did well, and I think, well, we did a lot of things good as KLM in the past to stimulate the development of SAFs. But there's also a lot of work needed still. And indeed, we're only having less than 1% SAF in our fuel tanks. And although we were the largest, one of the largest users of SAF for the last couple of years as KLM, I think together with United, for us it was only 0.18% at maximum. So yeah, it still goes about little amounts. And whereas we started with a first flight actually in 2009 already, it was a demonstration, and then we followed up with a commercial flight in 2011 already. We founded Sky Energy together with 2 other partners, and these were really steps that kickstarted, I think, the use of SAF, together with a corporate program that we started in 2012 with a few corporate partners, such as Heineken and Philips, for example. And we're still having these partners on board to stimulate the use and scale up of SAFs in our tanks. But that's not enough, and that's what we're realizing. And I'm really happy that we're talking here also about this topic, but we should go beyond talking. And I'm actually happy that this webinar is one of the webinars that is online at these times, because up to 1.5 or 2 years ago, maybe there was a few talks on sustainable aviation fuel, or there was some invitations at panels, but it was not so present as it is now. And that's something which is very good news, I think. And I hope that this really helps to stimulate this production and scale up of the use of SAF. And something that I'm very proud of for the last months is that we also proved that unless we all have the experiences with COVID and the what it causes, but we were able to also develop ourselves and start and make a first commercial flight on sustainable synthetic fuel as well, which is a new technology. And I think what's already mentioned, the first question in the chat was, is it only about biofuels or also e-fuels? And this is of course in the category of e-fuels, or how you want to call it, synthetic fuels. But yeah, we have to look into a bunch or a mix of these technologies in the future if we want to reach that net zero emissions aviation. It's indeed a mix of very efficient aircraft, a mix of types of sustainable aviation fuel, and maybe also a mix of other mobilities. And that's something that's more on top of mind for people in Europe, probably, because we have quite a good train network internationally, which can be very much improved, of course, as well. But that's where we have to go to, and I'm happy to be in this panel and look forward to where we're going to talk about next.
Thank you, Ramona. And Andrea, it's all about availability, isn't it? We spoke about this earlier. A very naive question might be, if Air BP and all the other oil companies are so committed to sustainability and a greener future, why do you not simply increase the number of airports at which it's available?
Thank you, Murdo. It's a difficult question to answer because Ramona mentioned that the activities in this sector have started long ago. We powered our first SAF flight all the way back in 2008. And since then, we've supplied in 20 locations on 3 continents. There's been a lot of initiative in the sector, but I would say only in the most recent 2 years, we've seen significant action that is likely to lead to increased availability. What suppliers need to implement projects is certainty of demand, and with the higher cost of SAF, or sustainable aviation fuel, it's very hard to have that certainty of demand. But what we're seeing in the last couple of years is very good collective action from governments, public corporations that are demanding changes, and they're willing to pay for SAF or sustainable aviation fuel, or come up with different regulations and policies that help support the price. We know from other industries, ground fuels and renewable power, that with learning, cost can come down. So at the moment, we're in this very incipient stage where we're launching more production, and we're going to learn more about reducing technology costs and eventually get the cost down. So it's going to start a cycle of more availability leads to more demand, and so on. I would say any action in securing demand certainty through government policy is very welcome by all suppliers. The other aspect that I wanted to talk about is types of SAF, and Michael and Ramona have mentioned here a bit about this. There's multiple pathways that have been approved, and so far only one of those pathways has brought fuel to the market. And Fulcrum, which is a company we're also an investor in, is about to launch their production in the first plant. So this is a second type of pathway. All the others are still in incipient stages. Actually, I'd say there's a couple more that have brought test product to the market. But certainly some of these pathways will switch from R&D to commercial development in the next few years. And I'm quite optimistic on the volume. So we're seeing today there's maybe only 100,000 tons of product available in the market. By 2030, we see that number be as high as 20 million. And of course, we need something upwards of 180 million by 2050 to meet the IATA goals. What BP is doing to participate in providing more SAF to the market is we have a very strong strategy. We've looked at all these pathways. We look at where we can be strong within our own investments. And there's modifications to existing refinery toolkits, but also standalone investments and projects. And there's just a lot of action happening there. And I feel like the momentum has really picked up in the last couple of years. And I'm optimistic to how this discussion and this panel might sound like in a couple of years from now.
Great. Well, perhaps we can come back in 2 years. I hope so, and take this talk about this again. It's certainly a very fast-moving topic. I just wanted to pick up on a point you made there, Andrea, about the different sorts of SAF, because we talk about sustainable fuel, but coming on to an audience question here about e-fuel, and Ramona, you talked about this as well. And fuel from waste, as Lauren referred to, with what United's been doing, and also biofuel. I mean, does anyone want to just talk about some of the issues around this? Because there has been criticism of biofuel in that, how sustainable is it? Because if it involves growing a whole bunch of crops to make biofuel rather than growing something that we could eat or whatever, then is it necessarily sustainable? So does anyone want to just talk about some of the ethical issues around the technologies and the practical issues around some of the alternative types of SAF? Does anyone want to, Michael, do you want to come in on that one?
Sure. So first and foremost, we never want to compete with first use agricultural food crops. So we see a lot of, and it was discussed that most of the SAF that's made it to market is from really a single pathway, and most of that is really predominantly based on used cooking oil, and so that's been the major source. But there are other uses. For example, agricultural rotational crops, camelina as an example, are used when fields lay fallow, and those could be processed through some of these pathways, at least two of the pathways, into making sustainable aviation fuels. But as Lauren said, probably the most opportunistic would be to use municipal waste. That's trash and sewage. And when you think about it, when trash goes into landfill and sewage isn't treated properly, it actually produces natural gas or methane. And methane is actually far worse. Over a 50-year cycle, it's about 58 times worse than CO2 in the environment in terms of its global warming potential. And so you can actually, by doing the conversion, you actually remove it from the ecosystem. The other thing that's really an opportunity is that where we have major airports and where we have major demand, particularly for travel, right, especially the international travel, 80% of our fuel burn is in 1,500 kilometer or longer missions. Those typically correspond to megacities. And the megacities are replete with lots of trash and lots of people, which produces lots of sewage. And so it's a great opportunity for a global solution that could be used as a win-win, both for society, but also for the industry.
Thanks, Michael. Andrea, do you want to come in on that one?
Yes, just real quick to add how we hold the different pathways. And by the way, BP is committed to not utilizing feedstocks that are impacting indirect land use change. So we're very, very particular and very committed to sustainability of feedstocks. In the next decade, it's likely that waste oils and municipal solid waste are going to be the workhorses of SAF. We see emerging technologies in second generation biomass, and by second generation I mean not it's just residue. It's agricultural or forestry residue that already exists and is not currently being utilized. So there's technologies that will start picking up this waste, and there's a lot of it around the world that can be processed into SAF. And e-fuels is kind of the one that's out there. It's like the most interesting one because the potential is unlimited, really, if you have enough renewable power. So this is a technology where you utilize renewable power to liquid. It is the most expensive one, but with government policy, this fuel may come to the forefront, and we're already seeing initiatives in Europe that may bring some e-fuels or power to liquid or synthetic fuels. You'll hear all of these terminologies about it sooner than later. So what we see, though, and this is really important to land, is that there is not one single winner. We will need all of these pathways to provide the full solution to the aviation industry.
Okay. Let's have Adam and then Ramona.
Thanks, Murdo. We're in risk of having a heated agreement because everything that Michael and Andrea said, I'd agree with. All of the work that Sustainable Aviation's done in terms of evaluating the potential impacts of sustainable aviation fuels in the UK envisages moving through those fuels which are contributing most strongly now. So things like HEFA-based fuels, HEFA and alcohol to jet. And then over the next 5 years, we'll start to see more and more emergence of fuels based around gasification of waste, and then Fischer-Troping that to produce a mixture of fuels of which the aviation fraction will be a proportion. In theory, there's sufficient waste available in the world in order to provide all of the SAF requirements necessary in the period up to 2050, but that only works on the basis that those wastes, whether it's agricultural waste, forestry waste, or MSW, aren't diverted elsewhere. And I think it's unrealistic to expect that aviation will have first dibs on those inputs or feedstocks. And I think over time we'll start to see changes in the economics with regards to the gate fees that the waste can attract, which then contribute towards the economics. Because at the moment, one of the benefits of waste to fuel is that often you're paid to take the waste in the first instance, and that represents an important proportion of the revenue and the economics of making it commercially viable. From probably early 2030 onwards, we'll start to see the emergence of e-fuels powered by low carbon power from wind, low carbon power from solar, potentially low carbon power from the nuclear sector. And I think by the 2040s, it's likely that e-fuels will be, if not the single largest contributor to SAF, then possibly in second place. And I agree completely with Andrea that we will need HEFA, we will need alcohol to jet, we will need waste to fuel, we will need e-fuels, and we will also need new fuels which don't compete for the same feedstocks, and also potentially fit with local conditions in terms of the need to produce SAF.
Thanks, Adam. Ramona, do you want to come in, and then I'll come to Lauren?
Yeah. So I think what's important to realize still is that aviation is expected to grow as well, and actually the amount of energy or green energy available on the world is also limited yet, and of course that needs to grow, especially for the production of power to liquid synthetic fuels. That's one of the major challenges we still have, right, for that to produce. And then the point is also, where is that green energy, renewable energy being used for? Because we also have our households to be powered with a renewable source of energy. And to be very honest, it's only a very small percentage of the world population that uses aviation currently. So yeah, the demand question, or actually, yeah, the supply and demand question, of course, that's still one thing to solve as well. And although it should be indeed a combination of things, we shouldn't keep out of eye that we are also part of a worldwide system, which is not only aviation but also a combination with other transportation modalities. And we also see that there's developments in shipping industry and also in the heavy car transport, or how do you call that, industry, for power to liquid and those kind of fuels. So yeah, there should be a solution for finding that balance, or finding that mix, that ideal mix for every different kind of industry as well.
Thank you. Lauren, do you want to come in on that?
Absolutely. You know, I agree with the comments. I mean, from what I see right now, there's going to be constraints everywhere, whether you're looking at the feedstock side of the equation, or if you're looking at the infrastructure for renewable. I mean, 100%. I hope we're in a place a decade from now where e-fuels or power to liquid is a promising solution, but that is completely contingent on the ability of our whole power sector to really transition. So there's a lot of work to do there. And I do think there will be this natural friction, which I think is a healthy friction, of demand around access to that. I like to say that, you know, moving aviation to sustainable aviation is a strategy of all things on the table. And I think that's what this conversation just demonstrated.
Okay.
If I could
Michael,
just add one thing to what Ramona and Lauren said. 2 points I think are important. Number one, if you look at aviation, the aggregate use of energy, it's about 15% of the world's power grid today. Right? That's in 2019 numbers. And when you think of a jet engine flying along, modern jet engines, 50 to 55% efficient. When you compare that with the world electric grid, it results in about 15 grams fewer of CO2 per kilowatt hour than the world electric grid today. That jet engines flying today are producing less CO2 than the world electric grid. So before we consider power to liquid, yes, locally in certain parts of the world, they have a greener grid, but in aggregate, we have to think about this as a global solution. So that's an important point. The other point to make is that when it comes to uses of fuel, cars and trucks and buses don't have to fly. And so a lot of their needs can be met with batteries, whereas aircraft and propulsion systems for aircraft, the mass energy, the specific energy content in a battery is about 40 times worse today than in jet fuel. And it's going to be a long time, but focusing the renewables, the SAF, on flight will help bridge that. We really need to look at this across multiple industries.
Yes, very, very good point. I just want to bring in a couple of audience questions, and I'm going to combine these kind of into one question, if I may. We've got a question from Paul Constable about what government's role should be in this, in terms of being a catalyst, in terms of being a facilitator, a funder. But I'm also going to ask a more specific question from Chris Lyle, which is about carbon offsetting. Would it be an idea to redirect what he calls out-of-sector carbon offsetting to in-sector offsetting of SAF development? So is offsetting or redirecting carbon offsetting a good way to provide the impetus to get this moving? Does anyone want to come in on that? Adam, you were first with a hand up.
Can I answer the first question? In terms of the role of governments, if we think about what the principal challenges or constraints on deployment of SAF are, the moment it's important that organisations such as BP can have confidence in the volume. So clearly developing policies around mandates, which is something that's being done in Europe, it's being done in the UK and elsewhere in the world, is important for giving confidence with regards to the likely market for the SAF in the first instance. there's little point in having confidence in the size of the market if you're not confident that the prices that you can achieve for the SAF are likely to cover your costs and also deliver a margin that's, you know, that's linked to the level of risk that you're taking. And therefore, not only do you have to have policies that support the volume, but also support the price. And governments, again, around the world are starting to look at what kinds of policies, whether that's things like contracts for differences, etc., in order to allow organisations to make the necessary investments. And then the third area that's where it will be necessary in the short term is to actually support the projects themselves. So one of the calls that Sustainable Aviation made at the time that we published our net zero decarbonisation roadmap was support to close the funding gap for first of a kind pilot projects. And this could be in the form of loan guarantees, it could be in the form of green bonds, but certainly for early stage projects where the risk is extremely high, in the same way that it's been necessary for governments to provide early stage support for other environmental technologies, whether it was solar or wind, there will be a case for supporting the early projects, irrespective of whether it's you know, waste or electrofuels, e-fuels or power to liquids, etc.
Thank you. Andrea, do you want to come in on this, the government role, and also perhaps something about how carbon offsetting might work? And then Lauren, I'll come to you.
Okay, thank you. Governments can support development of SAF through policies. First, the easiest one is mandates, where you put everyone on a level playing field and everyone pays for the carbon that's emitted while they're traveling. There are some governments that are not so comfortable with mandates, but even in those countries, we see lots of examples of policy that can help, such as tax credits or some sort of carbon cap and trades, or the LCFS programs that we're seeing on the West Coast in the US that have been very successful to promote demand. So there's many ways in which governments can promote development of SAF. And I would say one very important point to make is that while we support in general carbon pricing across all industries, we do see a need for aviation to receive extra help, because aviation is a very hard to decarbonize sector. We were talking earlier about the fact that ground transportation can switch to electric or to hydrogen. Well, to get from renewable power to aviation fuel, you lose energy when you move to green hydrogen, and then you lose energy again to move to liquid fuels. So aviation cannot compete on a carbon pricing fairly with ground fuels, and it needs disproportionate help in terms of policy from governments. So I hope people who lobby with governments see that well, because it is needed to bring into the fray here. We've been struggling in our refineries with economics between ground fuels and aviation, and we're seeing some movements in the right direction in some geographies. In terms of offsetting, I'm gonna try to remember the question there, but I think the question was, can we move from out of sector into in-sector offsetting, right? Yeah. So the way we see that, and I think United has some projects in this sense, we see that demand from several of our customers who are interested in saying, well, we like natural climate solutions, but we really want to make an impact on aviation emissions. And I think we're seeing some projects, and there's definitely energy projects that we could bring forward in our portfolios. There's a role for offsetting, even with the aviation sector reaching its IATA goals of reducing emissions by 50% in 2050, there's still the other 50%, right? So our view is that offsetting has a role to play with high quality projects. And we do see a need to identify more industrial projects besides the natural climate solutions that have been quite successful so far.
Excellent, thank you. Lauren, I'll come to you, and I'll come to Ramona for after that.
Great. Okay, I will start with the offsetting since that's where we are today. So there are opportunities to redirect your funds or your interest away from outside of your supply chain to inside of the supply chain for aviation to decarbonize. For example, United invested in a direct air capture plant, which does the work. It removes as much carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as 40 million trees. So I agree. I think there's a role for nature-based and technology-based solutions. And I think, again, it's an all things on the table solution. United just launched an opportunity for our customers, both corporate, cargo, as well as individuals, to actually contribute their funds towards additional sustainable aviation fuel, whether that's through procurement of fuel or investment in the next generation of producers. And there's been tremendous interest. Moving on to the role of government, I understand the passion and interest in mandates. I think we have to do it with an eye towards, does that artificially drive up the price of sustainable aviation fuel when there's a supply limit? Here in the US, United has been working with a host of partners to really support a blender's tax credit, which is performance-based, and that's pretty interesting. There's a $1.50 credit for sustainable aviation fuel which increases to $2 per gallon based on the carbon intensity of the fuel. So it incentivizes the lower carbon fuel production. And so finding ways to really use market-based mechanisms, I think, is really a pathway forward that's promising, because the market's there. Everyone knows we need to decarbonize. Everyone's interested in moving to lower carbon sustainable products across sectors. And now it's just finding the right mechanism and the right opportunity to get there. The last thing I'd like to say is that United also launched just 2 days ago an opportunity for our individual passengers to write to their elected officials. So elected officials in Congress and their governors to advocate for the right kind of climate policy that supports permanent long-term solutions for sustainable aviation fuel. And I'm thrilled to say that in just over a day, almost 2,000 emails have been sent to elected officials from individual customers saying, I care and it's time. So there's a lot of opportunity for us to lean into the role of government to help us facilitate this transition.
Okay, thank you. Ramona?
Yeah, so I just want to add, I think, 2 things, and I also have a question for Andrea. So I think what's most important when first thinking about any policy or incentive related to SAF is that we should make very clear that the requirements for sustainability are at the forefront of every policy. So you can, of course, think of any mandate or any policy incentive, whatever you want, but if there's not the right sustainability requirements to the type of SAF and the technology used, we have a problem, because then it's not a sustainable solution. And if it's not there, I think the public opinion about SAFs and about airlines trying to become more sustainable will also not be better. So this is something that we advocate for, at least within European context as well, as Air France KLM, since the beginning of the development of SAF, and that's still is very important. And of course, I'm glad that there's more parties striving for that. So that's the good news. But it should be done worldwide, not only in Europe, because it's indeed a worldwide challenge that we have. And then secondly, I just had a question actually, and that's because if we all need to go to a scenario where it's in 2050 net zero, or that we don't emit anymore. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's also the goal of BP. And how are we going to manage that? Because if that's the case, then all the fuel that we can purchase as airlines should be not derived from fossil energy anymore. Either, if you solve it by carbon capture technologies, but I'm also curious to that perspective.
Yes, excellent question. I think just looking at BP's announcements in last year, we committed to net zero ourselves by 2050 for our own operations, which is about 55 million tons of carbon per year. But we also want to help the world decarbonize, and to that goal, our intention is to reduce the carbon intensity of the products that we make by 50% by 2050 or sooner. That means a lot more investment in bioenergy and projects that produce SAF, amongst other things, but there's certainly investments in hydrogen and electric and onshore and offshore wind. So we're definitely having a major green energy transition that goes above and beyond aviation. So I think we're not alone. A lot of our peers have recognized the need to do this, and I'm really proud that the industry is making a significant shift in this direction, and not only setting commitments, but actually changing the way we invest, and starting to invest not in growing fossil projects, but actually growing green projects for the future.
Thank you. Well, we've got 43 questions, which is incredible. We're not going to be able to get to quite that many, but I just wanted to try and get through a couple more at least very quickly. So one question which we did cover before, but maybe someone, I won't come around the whole panel, but maybe someone can just come in and give a quick explanation. We've had questions about hydrogen power and electric power. I'm not going to talk about these today. We covered them in a separate webinar. We're going to be focusing on sustainable fuel today. But could someone just define what is meant by e-fuel or synthetic fuel, and just very quickly explain where we are with the development of that? There we go. And Andrea, let's come in on that.
Do you want to go,
one.
Adam?
Okay, thank you. So my understanding of e-fuels is where you're using low carbon electricity to generate hydrogen via electrolysis, and then combining that hydrogen with a sustainable source of carbon, and in order to then, typically via Fischer drops, convert that into an aviation fuel, a liquid aviation fuel, which looks, certainly this is I mean, e-fuels could cover any, gases or liquids, but certainly in the case of aviation, we envisage it as moving from low carbon electricity via electrolysis with sustainable carbon to a liquid fuel with similar characteristics to conventional jet fuel.
Okay, and Andrea, is that it?
I'm just gonna add a couple of things there, because we were talking about availability earlier. Yeah. Perfect answer, Adam. The challenges are with renewable power. Do we have enough? Are we going to have enough? We need to increase the amount of global renewable power many folds to satisfy aviation demands. The next challenge is electrolyzer capacity. This is an incipient segment of the industry that is expected to grow a lot more, and they're likely going to benefit of a good cost learning curve efficiency there, but there's a need for a lot of electrolyzer capacity. And then the last bit is sustainable carbon sources. So there's a lot of industrial sources today that could be used, right? There's cement plants and steel plants and all kinds of sources of carbon. The world wants a sustainable source of carbon, and those projects like the one that Lauren mentioned earlier, where you capture carbon from the air, they're very expensive, and they're not scalable at the moment. It's hard to imagine how you're going to be able to have that at a scale that the aviation needs. So there's challenges in all of those areas, but we're going to learn a lot in the next 10 to 20 years, and I think it's going to be really impressive. It's the one type of fuel that can benefit from disruptive technology, and I think a lot of people are doing R&D in these areas right now.
Okay, I'm just sorry, Michael. Do you want to come in very quickly on that one?
Just Andrea, there's one other, and that is clean water.
Right.
We talked about not competing with food stocks. There's also not enough clean water for everybody on the planet, and producing clean water requires energy. So that's perhaps another constraint.
Mm-hmm.
Michael, we get one other question in from the audience, or two questions which I'm going to combine. I'm going to direct these to you, and it's about the engines. Do conventional turbofan combustion chambers have to be reconfigured to operate on SAF? Do engines have to be updated in any other way? So
thank you for the question. So first of all, jet engines have been getting better for 1.5% engines and airplanes, about 1.5% per year since the dawn of the jet age. And we can continue that. Today, it's constrained by investment, and with further investments in R&D, we can advance that even more. Jet engines are agnostic. We'll burn anything. We can burn 100% SAF although there are certain seals which are made with nitrile materials in some of the legacy engines that may not be compatible with the lack of aromatic species. So when you think about sort of a Fischer-Tropsch process, you get out about 20% of your input feedstock is what we define as the SAF blendant today. In there are no aromatics, and the aromatics play a role in terms of the swelling of these O-rings, these nitrile components. There's other factors we need to look at for 100%, like lubricity, like and hydricity and things like that. And once we have a standard for 100% SAF, the engines can be and will be designed to address that. Hydrogen, we burned hydrogen in engines back in 1958, part of Project Suntan. And we could just burn hydrogen today fairly easily. However, to store it on the airplane, you need to actually liquefy it because it's about 4 times the volume. And so there's about 15% of the specific enthalpy of that fuel actually goes into that liquefaction process. So you'd want to use some kind of a thermodynamic expander cycle to take advantage of that. That's exactly what we did in the 1950s, and we're relooking at many of those technologies today.
Thank you, Michael. Well, sadly, our time is just about up. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. And I'm going to finish by asking our panel to fast forward 10 years from now. COVID is a distant memory. The global aviation industry is thriving again. How prevalent, if we're sitting here in April 2031, how prevalent will sustainable fuel be? Will it be powering the majority of flights, a substantial minority? Will it be more about hybrid solutions? So very quickly, you've got about 30 seconds each. Let me ask each of you for a prediction. So Michael, let me start with you.
The decisions we make as a society today will answer that question. If we put the right amount of investments, particularly public investments, the blenders credits as referred to earlier as an example, and that money is focused directly in equalizing the price point between SAF and traditional jet fuel, that will enable us to get up the virtuous cycle and to actually have the volumes required. Combine that with more efficient engines and airplanes, and we'll be able to essentially get over the curve. And so that as we go back to 4.5% growth in commercial aviation, that we'll be producing an excessive amount of SAF to meet that demand.
Thank you. Lauren, where are we going to be in 10 years' time?
Well, I sure hope that on our long haul flights, we have 100% SAF. That would be fantastic, and it's absolutely attainable with the right support, as Michael pointed out. I think there's some diversification we can look at with our short haul flights and the technologies there. But certainly for long haul, I would love to see us 10 years from now talking about the next generation beyond SAF, because that's being used everywhere all the time.
Adam, what is sustainable aviation going to have achieved by 2031?
I'm sure others will focus, or others will talk about volumes. So in 10 years' time, I would like to think that we'll no longer be debating whether we can use 100% blends of SAF. I would like to think that the life cycle CO2 benefits would be higher than they are at the moment, and we will have driven carbon out of the production system. I'd like to think that the economics will be much more favorable than they are at the moment, and the delta between the price of conventional jet fuel and SAF will have closed. I'd like to think that end users would be comfortable with any remaining delta and be prepared to make pay modest premiums on top. And I'd like to think that we fully recognize the non-carbon benefits of sustainable aviation fuels in such a way, and we're able to monetize those and close the economic gap in such a way that the commercial attractiveness is very good, and that we've set in train the investment in technology and the investment in infrastructure and projects, that we're well set for wide-scale use of SAF into the 2040s and 2050s.
Thank you, Adam. But a minute left. Ramona, could I ask you for your prediction?
Yeah, a few words. I think I hope SAF would be the standard in 2030. Of course, I would hope that. However, I'm also a bit realistic, thinking that if you start building a new SAF plant now, it takes a few years to come, right, and to produce to actually actively produce SAF. So I think the major message that I want to put out here is that we have to accelerate. We can't afford it to wait. We really have to do it, all of us. So I think that would be my main message, and then maybe it's the standard in 2030.
Thank you, Andrea.
My wish is that by 2030, most of the pathways we talked about are commercial, and there are projects that produce SAF in all areas of the world, in conjunction with the advantages of each region and their policies. I would also love that the public understands and appreciates the sustainability and the amount of effort that goes into SAF, and rewards the industry with positive appreciation for all the work that is going into this. And to be very realistic on the amount of investment and the number of plants that need to be on the ground to reach the IATA goal, I would say maybe we're going to be about 10% of the road to 2050 by that point.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, that unfortunately brings us to the end of what has been a fascinating discussion. I'd like to thank all our panelists for giving so generously of their time and their expertise today. I know we could have talked for another hour, but unfortunately our time is up. I'd also like to thank once again Pratt & Whitney for its support today and making this webinar possible. And thank you, of course, for joining us and asking such thought-provoking questions. I'm sorry we were only able to cover a small proportion of them. So please keep an eye on FlightGlobal.com, where we'll be publishing details of upcoming webinars. We'd love to have you join us again. Until then, from the Flight Global team, goodbye and stay healthy.